For years, Oliver imagined what becoming a millionaire would feel like. He pictured the moment clearly. Maybe he'd smile. Maybe he'd call his parents. Maybe he'd finally feel like all those years of saving had been worth it. Instead, it happened on a Wednesday evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, checking his investment account like he'd done hundreds of times before. And there it was. $1,002,417. Oliver looked at the screen for a few seconds. He refreshed the page. The number didn't change. After more than 25 years of saving and investing, he was officially a millionaire. His wife walked into the kitchen and asked if he'd remembered to take the trash out. He laughed, closed his laptop, and took out the trash. That was it. No celebration, no dramatic realization. The next morning, he went to work exactly as he always had. And that's when something strange started bothering him. If he'd finally reached the number he'd been chasing for decades, why didn't anything feel different? If you've ever wondered what it's actually like to reach $1 million, or you're working toward that goal yourself, consider subscribing. On this channel, we look beyond the headlines and explore the psychology behind money, wealth, and the decisions that shape our financial lives. Now back to Oliver. The truth is, most of us grow up believing that $1 million is the finish line. It's the number movies talk about, the number people dream about, the number that supposedly separates ordinary people from the wealthy. But what if that picture is decades out of date? What if becoming a millionaire today doesn't mean what it used to? Because that's exactly what Oliver was beginning to realize. He wasn't living in a mansion. He wasn't flying first class. He wasn't buying expensive watches or sports cars. In fact, from the outside, his life looked almost exactly the same as it had the week before. And he isn't unusual. Millions of people spend years chasing this milestone, only to discover that the feeling they expected never quite arrives. Not because $1 million isn't a remarkable achievement, it absolutely is. But because somewhere along the way, we confused a financial milestone with an emotional one. And those two things are rarely the same. To understand why, we first have to look at what $1 million actually means today. Here's what surprised Oliver the most. He had spent years believing that $1 million would completely change his life. But the truth was, the number had changed long before he reached it. Think about what $1 million meant 30 or 40 years ago. Back then, it represented extraordinary wealth, a house, luxury vacations, financial freedom that seemed almost impossible to imagine. Today, that same number doesn't buy nearly as much. Not because $1 million became small, but because everything around it became more expensive. Homes cost more. Healthcare costs more. Travel costs more. Even everyday groceries cost more than they used to. Without realizing it, the finish line quietly moved. The word millionaire stayed exactly the same, but what it could actually buy slowly changed year after year. Then Oliver discovered something else that completely changed how he looked at the number. Having $1 million and living off $1 million are two very different things. Imagine your investments are worth $1 million. Most financial planners don't suggest spending the whole amount. Instead, many use a guideline of withdrawing around 4% each year to help make the money last over a long retirement. That's about $40,000 a year. Suddenly, the picture looks different. A $1 million portfolio isn't a machine producing unlimited wealth. It's producing an income, a very useful income, but not the luxury lifestyle many people imagine. That's when Oliver stopped thinking about his portfolio as a giant pile of money. He started thinking about it as something much more practical, a paycheck, one that arrived whether he went to work or not. And that realization changed everything, because he finally understood that becoming a millionaire wasn't about becoming rich overnight. It was about buying options. The option to retire a little earlier, the option to work fewer hours, the option to say no to a job he hated. That's a very different kind of wealth, and maybe a much more valuable one. But there was still one part of the story Oliver hadn't considered. Just because his net worth said $1 million didn't mean he actually had $1 million sitting in his bank account. And that difference turns out to be far bigger than most people realize. This is where Oliver discovered something that almost nobody talks about. Being a millionaire doesn't necessarily mean you have $1 million available to spend, because net worth and cash are two completely different things. Imagine someone owns a house worth $600,000. They have $350,000 invested for retirement and another $50,000 in savings. Technically, they're a millionaire, but that doesn't mean they can suddenly spend $1 million. Most of their wealth is locked away. The house provides a place to live. Selling it means finding somewhere else to live. The retirement accounts are meant for the future. Taking large amounts out too early can come with taxes or penalties, depending on the account and your age. So while the number on paper looks impressive, the money isn't sitting in a checking account waiting to be spent. That's why Oliver still thought carefully before making large purchases. If his car needed repairs, he didn't simply swipe a millionaire card. He still had a budget. He still planned ahead. And surprisingly, that's true for many people who reach this milestone. The other thing Oliver noticed was that most millionaires didn't look the way he'd imagined. They weren't driving exotic cars. They weren't covered in designer brands. Many lived in ordinary neighborhoods, worked ordinary jobs, and drove reliable cars they'd owned for years. From the outside, you'd never guess they had seven-figure net worths. That's because wealth and spending often move in opposite directions. People who look rich usually spend more money. People who become rich often keep more of it. That's an important difference. One creates the appearance of wealth, the other quietly builds it. Oliver realized he'd spent years assuming wealthy people looked a certain way. But the more he learned, the more he saw that real wealth is often invisible. You don't see the investments quietly growing. You don't notice the paid-off mortgage. You don't recognize the years of patient saving. You only see the things people choose to buy. And those are often the least important part of someone's financial life. That's when Oliver stopped asking, how wealthy does someone look? And started asking a much better question. How much freedom do they actually have? Because in the end, that's the number that matters. So, was Oliver disappointed? Not at all. He simply realized he'd been chasing the wrong picture. For years, he thought becoming a millionaire meant living differently. In reality, it meant worrying differently. Or more accurately, worrying a little less. His life didn't suddenly become luxurious, but it became stable. He no longer lay awake wondering how he'd handle an unexpected expense. He didn't feel trapped in a job he hated. He knew that if life forced him to slow down, his investments were there to support him. And that's something far more valuable than it first sounds, because real wealth isn't about buying everything you want. It's about knowing you don't have to panic when life becomes unpredictable. That's the freedom Oliver had really been building all those years. Not the freedom to buy a sports car, the freedom to choose. The funny thing is, most people spend their lives chasing a number. Then when they finally reach it, their brain quietly moves the goalpost. 1 million becomes 2 million. 2 becomes 5. The feeling they're searching for always seems to exist just a little further away. Oliver realized something many people never do. If you always measure your life against the next milestone, you'll never actually experience the one you've already reached. That doesn't mean you stop growing or stop investing. It simply means you recognize progress while it's happening. Because financial goals are important, but they're only useful if they improve your life along the way. The biggest reward wasn't seeing 7 figures on a screen. It was knowing that decades of quiet, ordinary decisions had created something that could now support him instead of depending on him. And maybe that's the biggest misunderstanding about becoming a millionaire. It doesn't usually arrive with fireworks. It arrives with peace of mind. It looks like sleeping a little better, feeling a little less anxious, having a few more choices than you had before. From the outside, it might not look like much has changed, but from the inside, everything has. Because in the end, wealth was never really about becoming someone different. It was about quietly building a life where money becomes less of the thing you think about and more of the thing that gives you the freedom to think about everything else.